So let me begin with punk. Punk was many, many different things, but I think that we can understand it as a response to this political and economic crisis, to an idea that there really was anarchy in the UK, and the only possible reasonable response to that would be an embrace of anarchism. This is why the Sex Pistols were so fond of shouting out things like, no future, and all of the other things that you heard them shouting, all the other obscenities that you heard them shouting at the beginning of this class. Punk, and not just the Sex Pistols, I think, shared a similar critique of the social democratic system, as we'll see with Mrs. Thatcher. They were certainly critical of the welfare state. The idea that emancipation could come through a system of welfare capitalism was something that it was profoundly opposed to, and the very way of life, the very structured and sort of way of life that meant for many people was something that it abhorred. There was also, I think, the widespread sense in the punk movement that affluence, the so-called affluence that their parents had grown up in, was going away, and in any case material goods would not lead to any type of emancipation. There's no surprise in that sense that punk was all about wearing clothes that were hanging by threads. It was a display, a conspicuous display of clothing as shredded, and as worse than being poor. If you're poor, you care about how you look. And of course, it was a criticism of all that horrible hippie stuff and all the embrace of alternative lifestyles that I talked about on Tuesday. It's sometimes claimed that the punk movement was represented a white riot, just as in the words of the famous Clash song, and that what we see in the punk movement was a revolt of the white male working class. I think we have to be a little careful about this argument. First of all, even though punk was characterized by a very masculine style, women were actually pretty central both to its style and to the practice of music. So one of my favourite bands at this time was Susie and the Banshees. The Slits was one of the first all-women bands. All-women bands hadn't really existed before then. And Vivienne Westwood, the clothes designer, arguably did more than anyone else to establish the very look of punk. So it's hard, I think, to ignore the role of women in the punk movement. Also, I think we have to be careful of branding punk simply a racist movement. It's clear that there were important forms of racism that emerged out of punk, particularly the skinhead culture that emerges in the post-punk era. We shouldn't, I think, mistake the punk use of fascist icons as being simply a sign of a lurking racism. They were designed to shock and to appall, not to, I think, be associated with a particular political platform. And as the Clash made abundantly clear, much of punk was actually deeply inspired by black music and by reggae in particular. Finally, I think we also have to acknowledge that there was a very transatlantic nature of punk. That punk didn't just come out of the chaos of Britain in the 1970s, that it also came out particularly from the sort of New York music scene, of the New York Dolls, of Iggy Pop, of the Ramones. All of these bands, I think, in important ways, began to anticipate some of the styles of music and the forms of performance that punk in Britain became associated, even though I think punk in Britain took them several steps further. Arguably, one of the most important elements of punk culture was its so-called DIY culture. The fact that you didn't have to be able to know how to play an instrument, as the Sex Pistols famously demonstrated. Okay? It was just about picking up a guitar and playing it. It was just about putting together any type of clothing, slashing it, sticking it together with pins and chains. Anyone could be their own fashion designer. Anyone could be their own, could set up a band and become a musician. Indeed, this was directly opposed to the so-called commercialization of youth that had gathered apace since the 1950s, when young people were meant to just simply buy the music and the clothes that were commercially aimed at it. For this reason, that, of course, the Sex Pistols used to sing about the great rock and roll swindle. They were doing, supposedly, something quite different. What I'm suggesting here is that punk promotes an idea of individual expression that looks not very dissimilar to the same emphasis upon individual fulfillment, both of hippie culture and of the sense of personal responsibility that was being promoted by Enoch Powell and Mrs. Thatcher. And finally, let's get to her at last. So what I'm saying here is that it's no coincidence that the Sex Pistols and Mrs. Thatcher both came to prominence in 1976. They didn't just come out of the same conditions, out of the same historical moment. They also shared really key features. When the Sex Pistols were singing about no future, Mrs. Thatcher was talking about the decline of Great Britain and how Britain would have no future unless it would grapple with the problems that she thought were structural to welfare capitalism and consensus politics. Indeed, what Mrs. Thatcher promoted was a turn away from consensus politics, a government through consensus, that everybody agreed around the mixed economy and the welfare state. She said, no, this has to change, we need someone to break the mould, and I am the person to be able to do it. There's also, of course, their shared hatred of the 1960s, but for slightly different reasons. One of Mrs. Thatcher's closest confidants was a man called Norman Tebbit, and he described the 1960s as that insufferable, smug, sanctimonious, naive, guilty, wet, pink orthodoxy of the sunset home and a third-rate decade. Couldn't really get a bigger condemnation of the 1960s, but I think it's one that would have been shared by many people who embraced punk music. Clearly, Mrs. Thatcher was deeply critical of welfare capitalism, of the idea that capitalism should be organised around the service of a socially democratic system with welfare for all. This was what she thought made Britain's economy uncompetitive. Just as that system promised protection from cradle to grave, promised careers that would begin after school and last for life, that this was the type of closet or the sense of a lifelong imprisonment that punk wanted to revolt against. So Mrs. Thatcher, of course, wanted a much more flexible labour market, and wanted, in a sense, to break up the forms of regulation that created those life patterns for many people during the post-war era. And finally, of course, Mrs. Thatcher was firmly opposed to immigration, firmly opposed to the idea of multiculturalism that was being promoted after the creation of the Commission for Racial Equality in 1976. One of the very first things that Mrs. Thatcher does in 1981 is to bring in the most exclusive or the most draconian immigration law ever introduced in Britain in 1981. Here, I think you can see that Mrs. Thatcher absolutely plays up to the forms of white racism that had emerged around Enoch Powell and the protests of the late 60s and early 70s. I think the key difference between Thatcher and punk, though, is that whereas punk thought the solution to all of this was the embrace of anarchy, or at least certain sections of the punk movement thought that the response to this was an embrace of anarchy, Mrs. Thatcher thought that actually the opposite was required. That what actually was needed was a new type of leadership, a new type of what she would recognise was an authoritarian leadership. It required a single person to break the mould, and break the mould so that Britain could be remade. And with that authoritarianism, as we'll see next week, came an insistence on the return to certain key moral values that she felt the 1960s had desecrated, which would have been profoundly different to those that the punk movement would have celebrated. So Mrs. Thatcher really was a punk, and you heard that here first. Okay, let me wrap this up. You'll remember that the arc of this class has been about this sequence, albeit this overlapping sequence, of a transition from the ancient regime to liberalism to social democracy to then something that I'll talk about, beginning to talk about today, but I'll talk about more on Tuesday, as neoliberalism. Okay? And what I've been suggesting in each of those, in each of these stages of the class, what I've been trying to say is, look, these are the characteristic features of these political and economic systems. But we have to recognise the way in which one always bleeds into the other. There isn't simply a revolutionary rupture where one gives way to the other. They always remain, in some sense, embedded in each other. Nonetheless, I've been trying to say for the last few weeks, since you all came back from Cancun, was that social democracy took an identifiably very, very different type of form between the 1940s through to the 1970s and even perhaps the 1980s. And yet the key issue that you need to grasp for this series of lectures and for the one that will come on Tuesday is why it, despite its success at promoting the standards of living of people in Britain, of transforming the infrastructure of that country in so many ways, why it became so vulnerable to criticism and why it began to be dismantled so quickly from the 1970s through to the 1990s. And I've given you a series of answers to that question. The first is, I have been suggesting to you that it was a victim of its own success, that in a certain way it was based around the idea of the emancipation of a traditional working class, that in many ways it succeeded in emancipation. And it was left instead trying to deal with people's aspirations and desires for some other form of fulfillment. Another important weakness of the social democratic system was that it always claimed to represent society as a whole, and yet it continued to do so in ways that created a particular view of the family, of gender relations, of the whiteness of the nation, and of generation, of the role of different generations. And that critically, one of the key things about those, the other weakness of those promises of a sort of universal welfare was that it never quite succeeded in building the infrastructures and providing, funding the very forms of welfare that it had promised. Another key feature that I've been talking about, and this is absolutely vital to Mrs. Thatcher's critique of social democracy, is that it was the creation of the new technocratic intellectual aristocracy, that it was a revolution for the people, not by the people. That this was something imposed upon them, as Mrs. Thatcher would have argued. And that the first thing that was required was therefore to strip away welfare professionals like teachers and doctors and social workers, the forms of authority and autonomy that they had been given under that system. Finally, what I've been saying is that one of the key elements of the structural weakness of social democracy is that it existed at a time where Britain's economy was being transformed by forces beyond its control. That is, by the process of decolonisation and by the increasing globalisation of the economy in the wake of the collapse of the Bretton Woods system and the rise of new deregulated flows of finance and of trade. And finally, what I've been trying to say is that the labour movement goes from being seen as the bedrock of the country, as it was in that film The Heart of Britain I showed you during the Second World War, where it was the workers who were the foundation of the country whose interests needed to be promoted and secured, to, by the 1970s, the labour movement and the trade unions being seen as the very people that were holding the country to ransom with their inflated wage demands and their policies of striking and bringing down governments. Okay? This was a very, very important shift. And of course, one of the very first things that the Thatcher administration do, as we'll see, culminated with yet another strike by the miners in 1983 and 1984, is the attempt to remove the power of the unions. Very important development. But I'll leave that for you on Tuesday.